I'll see if it works. Might take a minute. So it's still sending data.
I got a YouTube notification on my phone. Yeah, it's live.
Okay. It still for whatever reason says sending data on the restream thing, so it's concerning. Yeah. So it shows an upcoming stream still and a live one. What the hell?
Should I tweet that link or no?
Well, it says off on. Give it a minute.
Okay.
This is just restream being weird though, because Twitch is fine, and the only thing I change every time is the title. Does that sound alright?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
Track Twitch, testing 1, 2, 3. Twitch is good. YouTube. The delay kills me.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just heard the conversation of you saying, "Does it sound all right?" But yeah, all right.
All right, we gotta start the stream then. What did you tweet yet?
I just want to make sure the tweet. Yeah, okay, the YouTube link's right. All right, I'm good. Yeah.
Hello and welcome to episode 139 of the Ego Chall Podcast. My name is Preston Byers, and as always, I'm joined by my co-host Justin Binkowski. And on today's episode, we're talking about the Major 1 Week 2 qualifiers. The second week of the 2025 CDL season is in the books, and we are off to the holiday break. And before we know it, we will get to the first ever CDL minor. But we obviously want to talk about these matches. We want to talk about maybe some of the things that have changed or maybe have stayed the same, unfortunately, for Atlanta FaZe fans. But before we get to any of that, how are you doing, Bink?
Doing all right. Like you said, we're, second week of matches in the books already. Season's fully in swing and flying by. I know we do got a little holiday break coming up, but, before we know it, we'll be right back in there with the minor online and then more qualifiers before, we're on land. So, exciting stuff to talk about. Some unexpected upsets and some expected results for some teams. But yeah, can't wait to jump right in.
Two of the most interesting teams are two of the most popular teams this week, OpTic Texas and Atlanta FaZe. Is there a particular team that you would like to go and talk about first? Because they're interesting for their own various ways, I would say.
No, it doesn't matter.
Let's go with OpTic because we talked about them so much on the last episode. If you want to go back and listen to the conversation before, it was all confirmed. But Huke replaces Pred in the OpTic Texas lineup for this week's CDL matches, presumably for the foreseeable future. The reports or rumors, I forget who said it, was that Pred, I believe is the marksman from the Dope Check podcast. He said that Pred went back to Australia. So that would, presumably, obviously, we don't have CDL matches for a while anyway, so it wouldn't necessarily mean that he's gone when they get back. But it does seem like there might be some kind of separation here where Huke is the replacement going forward. But regardless, they play two matches this week. OpTic did with Huke in the lineup, and they go 2-0. They beat Vancouver in their first matchup 3-1. A pretty close series. Vancouver wins the first hard point, and then OpTic really bounces back and kind of controls the rest of the way. The second series was definitely much closer. They go to a game 5 with Gorilla's mate. They nearly get reverse swept. Huke drops 10 in the game 5. And he said after the game 5 in the post-match interview, he said, "I knew I was going to be able to be the big ice if I needed to." So the confidence is definitely there for Huke. OpTic looked pretty good, especially with all of the circumstances. I think this was about as great as they could look for, kind of all coming together in a week or so. What did you make of their 2 matches this week, OpTic Texas?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of like what we were talking about pretty extensively in the week leading up to this whole set of matches, but with the Pred and whatever rumors going on. We both were kind of, I think, on the same page that it felt like a pretty seamless, or we were expecting it to be a pretty seamless transition from Pred to Huke. We talked about the chemistry the guys on the OpTic had with Huke in terms of previously playing with him on previous teams. And just like the play style similarities between Huke and Pred, and it's kind of like what we saw here. It's, didn't necessarily take on, you know, a team like LAT or some of the world beaters, quote unquote, you would say for, the contenders in the league and whatnot. But they had a couple close matches here. We saw a bunch of matches across the league really that have been close. But for this in particular, the one thing I know we talked about was how would their S&D be affected by bringing in a new player on short notice and stuff. And I believe they went 3-0 in search with a Huke. So that's a good early sign there for a new team. Obviously, again, like we kind of mentioned, they have experience playing together previously, so I don't think it is shocking that they would seemingly pick back up where they left off and know each other's tendencies and whatnot. And it's early in the game, so it's not like they had to reinvent the wheel in terms of all their practice and everything going on. So yeah, I think that's probably where the thing that jumped out to me the most was the search and destroy looking good. We obviously historically on the podcast talked about some previous OpTic teams being known for being respawn teams and whatnot. And again, early in this Black Ops 6 season, small sample size, yada yada. But it's still good to see a team fresh off an emergency roster change, performing well in search, especially for someone like me, who is just a big search guy. So that definitely stood out to me. And yeah, I think OpTic is, I still think we talk about it on a bunch of other episodes about how the Green Wall expects, you ain't first, you're last. You expects them to win every game. So I think even despite all the Pred stuff going on before Huke joins, I still think the Green Wall is expecting 2 wins this weekend. But for them to actually deliver and take advantage of that's not how I wanted to say it, but for them to just deliver and show up and get the job done, that's definitely encouraging for Greenwall supporters.
Yeah, the S&D stuff was the thing I was concerned most about, and that's why when we talked about the pick'em, I picked Vancouver over OpTic because the first match with Huke, I wasn't entirely sure how it would go, in particular with Search and OpTic. It's I wouldn't say hit or miss with respawn because I think that is kind of overblowing it, but it really only takes losing one of those respawns, and if you're really shaky in Search, it could be a 2-3-5 kind of situation where the Surge win. It wasn't that though. OpTic, they lose that opening hard point. It was a 250-227 on a red card, and then they come back on red card S&D and they win 6-1. And I think what the most impressive thing is with this OpTic team this past week was that they won all 3 of their S&Ds on different maps. The first red card, then they went on Vault, and then they went on Protocol. So they showed that they can do it on a variety of maps, not just spamming 1 or 2 maps over and over and over again. So I think I was very impressed by OpTic. I think it gave me a lot of confidence for their team moving forward. Granted, like you kind of mentioned, they didn't play the toughest teams in the world, but they also didn't play, Vegas, for example. So I think they played some of the mid to bottom half teams, the guys that are floating around 6 to 12 at this point. But you got to play who you play, and they beat them. They went to a game 5. They didn't let it get to them that they were on the verge of being reverse swept, and they buckled down. They won Protocol S&D pretty convincingly 6-3. And honestly, that's as best as you can ask for, again, with the circumstances that they were under. Like, this is a surprise roster change from everything that has been reported and been talked about. So it's not like, this was, we got to get rid of Pred because he's just so bad at this or with that. Like, it was, they had to do this, and it seems like Huke was about as perfect of a replacement, or at least in this potential or this specific spot. I think he was about as perfect as you could get. So congrats to them. Congrats to the Green Wall that people aren't kind of dooming and glooming after week 2 of the CDL season. But I think they're in a really good spot as they get in to holiday break. One of the teams that is not in a good spot whatsoever as we go into this break is Atlanta FaZe. A team that has consistently finished at the top of the CDL's regular season standings for the first 5 seasons of the CDL's existence. They've always been the first seed going into champs. Granted, that still could happen. We are very, very early into the 2025 CDL season, but this is the worst start for Atlanta FaZe since the CDL has begun. They look so disjointed, which is not something that you could typically say about FaZe. And I'm just not entirely sure why that is the case. Because usually when a team looks poor or looks bad at the beginning of a season, you could say, well, they're a new roster. They're getting used to each other, blah, blah, blah. This is not a new roster. They should not be getting used to each other. They played an entire season together last season. And they finished, not the CDL season, but they won the Esports World Cup in June, I believe, or maybe July it was. They won the Esports World Cup. They showed that, okay, like, we can compete against these top-level teams. We can win tournaments, which was obviously something that they failed to do at the end of the season, where they got, I believe, 6th or something like that at Champs, which was their worst performance at the CDL championship in their team's history. And now it seems like they're almost starting back at stage 1, or starting at like the bottom, the bottom level, the ground floor, however you want to phrase it. Why do you, I don't want to get into like the granular stuff, but I don't know, like, is this FaZe roster the roster to do it, or is there a roster change that has to happen? Like, I'm just, give me your panic meter, because that was something that we talked about in the last episode. Like, if they lost maybe both of these matches this week, which they didn't, they won their first match of the season against Vegas, who I think we all agree is the worst team in the CDL right now. And so they get that first win, but that is the lowest bar that you could possibly leap over. So where is your panic meter with Atlanta FaZe as we go into this holiday break?
I'm still not overly concerned about FaZe, but I would say, like, the meter is definitely not on 0. It's at least slightly increased beyond that. The biggest, I don't know if the biggest is the right word, but just an interesting tidbit, or add on to this, is like, it has, just on paper and based on everything we know about the history of CDL and in these players and the matchups, like, you'd say on paper Atlanta should beat Carolina, but Carolina now is sitting at 4-0, and part of the equation, how you also have to ask, like, how good is Carolina? Like, is it just a case of, like, yeah, maybe you should expect Atlanta to beat them, but maybe they're just simply better at this point in the game? And I think that's the overarching, without knowing too much about what's going on behind the scenes and everything like that, it feels like in past years, FaZe was always that team that was just ahead of the game, and you know knew. I maybe it's still a case of that, where like they know some things and they're just not showing it early or whatever. But it always felt like that was FaZe's thing. Like they just started out of the gates hot because they played well early on, and maybe they just adjusted new games quicker or whatever. And maybe this time around they just haven't been able to get off to that quick start in Black Ops 6 because they just haven't adjusted to the new title as fast. And would have no idea why that would be the case, but like I think that's just got to be brought up. Is it like maybe Carolina is off to a 4-0 start because they were able to adjust quicker and just have a better read on what the game plays like and all that stuff. But um, I think like you probably many people expected Atlanta to beat Carolina, but part of it you do have to factor in and try and answer the question of maybe just this Carolina team is better than people expected. So, um, it definitely would be a slightly different conversation if Atlanta did lose to Vegas, because then I'm sitting here like, what the hell's going on? And I still think there is some degree of that. Like, it's still very confusing that a team with so many talented players like Atlanta and obviously I think very highly of Crowder as a coach and just the whole staff and everything there. Like, you just expect more out of Atlanta based on what we've seen and the talent on the team and all that. But at the end of the day, you do have to look at the teams they've lost to, and all three teams that they lost to are undefeated. I know, again, small sample size, um, but Toronto, LA Thieves, and Carolina have all played well early on, and you know that's gotta like it's not a non-factor in why Atlanta is 1-3. I'm not saying I'm not trying to avoid putting any blame on Atlanta or anything, because I do expect like you know you expect Atlanta to be a championship contender, and you expect them to be a team that's fighting to be in every single championship Sunday of every single LAN event. And based on what we've seen right now, like they, if the qualifiers ended today, they'd be in the losers bracket of a major, which I don't think they've ever started a major in the losers bracket. Like even LA Thieves had a couple of those online stages where they had like really bad runs online, and then they show up to the LANs and they play well on LAN. Like that hasn't even happened for Atlanta FaZe as far as I can remember. So definitely interesting times for FaZe. We're gonna have to see. Maybe they hit the grind a little bit over the holiday break and hit their stride and show us what we know they're capable of doing. But as of now, it's definitely a little puzzling that they're in this position.
The one thing that I think we can both say about Atlanta FaZe in the past has been their consistency is unmatched. Where, like you were talking about, they don't go into the losers bracket. They don't start in the losers bracket, and typically they don't go in the losers bracket until like at least like winter semis, winter finals. They are a very consistent team historically, and that is why this is so surprising that it's three consecutive losses to start the season, which I looked it up because I was just curious to see when that would have happened. That well, the thing is like that's never happened to start the season, which I think we both know. But previously, Atlanta FaZe had only lost three consecutive matches one time in the CDL, and that was in March 2023. They lost to the Toronto Ultra and OpTic in the third major to finish the major, and then they lost to the New York Subliners in the first qualifier match of Major 4. So it's not even like three consecutive in the same kind of environment. And that's, talking about Ultra, OpTic, and NYSL, the three best teams other than FaZe in that season. So that was the only other time before this week that they had lost three consecutive matches. And then I also looked up how did they start the seasons previously, and how long did it take for Atlanta FaZe to lose three matches in their CDL season? Because this time it took three matches, and that's pretty crazy. But 2020, it took them 21 matches to lose three. 2021, it was 17. 22, it was 12. 2023 was their lowest before this season, which was 9. So they played 9 matches before they lost 3. And then last year, it took 14 matches until they lost 3. Previously, the only season in which they did not start with a multi-match winning streak was 2023. They lost their season opener to the Boston Breach, and then lost 2 of their first 3, which I guess you could kind of compare that to this season and say, well, they started off slow then, but they kind of picked it up as they went. But still, this seems different. It seems like they're more disjointed than they've ever been. And I think you can look at some of these opening hard points against LAT, 250 to 77 on vault hard point. And then we saw it against Carolina, protocol hard point, 250 to 88. 100-point clubbed twice in the first 2 weeks of the CDL season. I guarantee that's never happened to FaZe before. It's probably never happened to any of these top teams that we consider to be championship contenders going into a season. So that seems different. That seems like a concerning trend. And I mean, like you mentioned, we do probably have to give a little bit of grace or maybe excuse them a little bit, because the teams that they lost to so far this season, the Toronto Ultra, who are 3-1, we believe that are, in the top 4, somewhere along those lines in the league so far. LAT, they could possibly be the best team in the CDL at this current point. They are 4-0, and the Carolina Royal Ravens, like you mentioned, 4-0. We're not sure exactly if they are a legitimate championship contender, but they certainly can't be dismissed at this point. Their only win, though, is against the Vegas Falcons, who I said earlier, the worst team in the CDL, another 0-4 team. I don't know. It seems weird. It seems like this is not something that can just be kind of hand waved away, but FaZe has kind of proven us wrong on a few different points in the past, so maybe we do need to give them more time. I do want to mention real quick, though, Ben J, who I think he worked with Atlanta FaZe, or he worked with FaZe Clan for sure before the CDL, and he was kind of going through some of the potential reasons why FaZe might be having this slow start, and he mentioned a few points, but I'll focus in on what he said was like the kind of the environment around them. So we obviously know Tupac, who's now with the Cloud9 New York coaching staff. He was with Atlanta FaZe for the past few seasons. He was let go because of budget cuts, which I don't know if you saw, but Tupac tweeted about it, I think after Carolina beat FaZe, and he just said budget cuts, and then he had a GIF right after the FaZe loss, which I thought was interesting. So Tupac's gone. I guess Classic is also gone. Proto, who Ben said I think he said something along the lines of like he's kind of important to their system. They don't have an analyst, and I think you also mentioned Gersh, which I think was more just like they don't have like the vibes necessarily around them anymore. But I think the point remains the same, that this is the environment around them is different, and not in a good way. Granted, I don't know all the inner workings of what's going on in or around the team, but I just thought it was interesting that someone who, is somewhat close, or should be in theory somewhat close to those guys, is speaking out about, some of the kind of lackluster parts of their environment at this point in time. But we'll see. They have plenty of time to figure it out. They're 1-3, I think 6-10 in the map count, if I'm not mistaken. So not the worst map count in the world, but again, something that I've said on the past few podcasts, like I grade FaZe on a curve. I'm not grading them, on the same way that I'm grading like Minnesota or Vegas, for example. Like this is Atlanta FaZe. They are historically the best CDL team. They've won world championships. Like I just expect more of them, and they have been disappointing this season. So we'll see if they're able to turn it around. A team that I do want to talk about more positively, because they deserve it, the Boston Breach. Our boys, the Breach, we're into the Breach now. We are 3-1 now. They're 60% of the way to their season total in wins last season, and we're only 4 matches in. They are still going to game 5s left and right. We are 4 matches in. They've gone to 4 game 5s. But unlike last season when they went 2-12 in game 5s, they are now 3-1. So if you can believe that, they've already won more game 5s through 4 matches than they did through 14 last season. Is Snoopy the MVP right now? I'm just going to come out and say it. Is he? He's probably our comeback player of the year, maybe.
I mean, I think that's where I would go to start it. Think MVP probably has to go to one of the undefeated teams, and probably one of the guys on LA Thieves, without thinking too much or looking at the actual numbers. But all kidding aside, I mean, yeah, you kind of just mentioned it, and I thought it was an important point to illustrate with FaZe, how I kind of had that just feeling that they're a team that gets off to a good start and you went through the records for them at the start of the seasons before they had 3 losses, yada yada, and doing the opposite here for Boston in comparison, like that just shows like, you know, this new squad obviously is more capable of finding success than the team that we saw last year, and that we got to give credit to Boston. Like, you know, I don't think joking is the right word, but just for lack of a better term, we kind of joked a little bit on behalf of Boston, like after the World Cup. I know I did at least. Like, yeah, they had their best placing of the year at the World Cup, but that's because they were literally in last place all the time leading into the World Cup. So this roster did perform better than the roster previously last year. I kind of played with that, but now like it's just like this. We're seeing they kept that roster from the World Cup, and they're seeing some early signs of life from that decision, and you know, especially for a team we talked about over the offseason multiple times. There were legitimately reports that Boston Breach might be leaving Call of Duty Esports. For them to have this start to the season is got to be a good feeling for the people involved there, and as a part of that decision to keep on pushing on and, you know, continue in the CDL. Um, Definitely can't say this was something I expected. I don't think it's something you expected either, but yeah, I mean, that's just, you know, the way things goes, I guess. Like, it feels like, you know, whether it's real life sports or esports in some capacity, whether it's COD or any other esport, there's always those teams where you know, the people who just, I know, like in sports you got like box score watchers or whatever you say, like people who just look at the stats, don't actually watch the games and stuff like that. And like, you know, I don't know necessarily what the equivalent would be for esports, but it's like, you know, you got your paper analysts or people who just look at the roster on paper and are like, oh yeah, that team's gonna be good, and then they go into like the LCS or Overwatch League when Overwatch League was a thing and stuff, and then that team stinks. And then conversely, you got the same thing where a roster, you see it and you're just like, oh, there's no way that roster is going to work. And then they come out and they're frying right off the bat. I mean, we kind of, we'll get to Carolina, but that was at least part of like the conversation when we were talking about Carolina was like maybe some of these guys' last opportunity to play well in the CDL and stick around long term. So, um, definitely just overall for Boston, it's got to feel good for, especially like you said, Snoopy, like a guy who a lot of people were doubting and doubting if he should even be in the CDL, let alone just playing the way he's been playing. Um, and for all those guys on the team, even like Awakening and Cammy, like Cammy more so than Awakening for what I'm about to say, like in terms of like MVP stats and stuff. Obviously, people joke about nicknaming like Big Wake, Giga Wake, all that stuff. And I don't think he's necessarily ever in like an MVP conversation, but just definitely in an all-star conversation. Like a lot of feel-good stories for the guys on Boston if they continue to play well. But I think that's also an important element, is like that this can't just be like a honeymoon phase or, you know, just like a spark at the start of the season and then they fizzle out and lose a bunch. Like they're gonna have to keep this up, and obviously early signs indicate that they're definitely gonna be more competitive than we were last year. So for Boston fans, people involved with that roster, the organization, definitely um, gotta feel good about where they're at right now.
And if you want to be pessimistic, to say like about Boston Breach, you could say, well, look at who they played. Outside of OpTic, who, whatever, like OpTic has looked better since then. Boston's played Minnesota, who they lost to, and then they played Miami, who's 1-3, and Vancouver, who's 1-3. If you want to be pessimistic, you can say that. If you want to be optimistic and say, when they played those types of teams last season, they lost like almost all the time. Like there were, again, 5 matches they won last season, and they went on a very, very long losing streak for like the back half of the season. So if you go back just a calendar year, they're losing these matches, and they're not losing them right now. And I think the fact that they're winning them in game 5s is really, really impressive. They're actually only one round 11 away from going 4-0 in the qualifiers. They lost round 11 on Rewind to Minnesota. They would have won that series otherwise. So I'm happy for them. I think, you kind of hit the nail on the head. Like there's a lot of doubt about, Snoopy in particular, but also a lot of these other guys who were in and out of the CDL last season, or maybe even multiple seasons now, and they're doing really well. and I think that can't go understated, or can't be appreciated enough, to see guys come back. I'm always really bearish on guys coming back into the CDL because there's not a great track record for those guys. Understandably, like, it's very hard to be competitive at this top level in competitive Call of Duty, but I like, someone like Gunless. I think I was very pessimistic about his return last season. It didn't end up going well for like him or Minnesota, but like just that kind of, using him as an example, it's just very tough to come back in and just be, on the same level as some of these other guys who've been playing against the top level competition over and over and over again for the past year or multiple years. And Boston, despite that, has been able to kind of push through it. And Cammy, who was an MVP level a few years ago, he's looking really good now. And maybe it's just he's found the right team. And to kind of piggyback off your point, like, we do kind of underestimate the teams and the aspect of, teamwork and whether guys can work together to actually accomplish goals. It's not all about just stacking talent on top of each other, which does help. You look at LAT and OpTic and, previously FaZe and NYSL, like those guys where it's just like, oh, we just have so much talent. Like, we're just going to see if we can, overwhelm teams with this firepower. Not every team is able to do that, though. And the Boston Breach isn't able to do that with just sheer overwhelming talent and star power, but they're finding ways to win, and that is incredibly important. And it's put them in a really good position as we go into the holiday break and as they get into the minor.
Yeah, I just want to highlight too. There was one I just remembered when I was looking through the notes. I know we talked about it last week when we were going over Boston's matches for this upcoming set. We both picked against them in both matches against Miami and Vancouver, and we were both kind of like, this is just an opportunity. I know I said, like, this is an opportunity to see more of Boston and all of those teams combined, because those are three teams, like, middle of the pack or, below potentially on paper, and we just wanted to get, more sample size, and obviously both of those matches end up going the distance to a game 5. But the one thing I just remembered now when I was looking through it was literally the first map, Vault Hardpoint against Miami. It was like that hard point where the two houses are on the back of Vault on the opposite side of where the pool is. I believe that's P4, but I'm getting it mixed up in my head. But no matter what, there was like a route Snoopy was taking on the left side of the hard point, and there's a door facing the side he was pushing, and like it almost, just to me, it felt like it kind of just showed growth in terms of Snoopy as a player, because I feel like it would have been very easy for the Snoopy we saw at points last year to just rush headfirst into that door right as he turn the corner and just try and chow whoever was in the hill. The hill had just popped, or it was about to pop. I don't remember exactly. But instead, Snoopy makes a play. He just ignores that door and goes around the back. And I think he might have only gotten 1 kill or 2 kills. I can't really remember how it went down. But I just remember I remember that route he took, like where he just goes around, and like that kind of, just to me, I could be like over dramatizing it, but that really just felt like to me something we probably didn't see out of Snoopy in the past, where he could have very easily, and I mean, other players, the same thing you could probably say for too. It's just like it felt like the easy play in that scenario would have been for him to just go right into that door and chow whoever was in the hill. Instead, he makes what turns out being a play to help set up his team for the winning and further go around, force engagements out in the hill, and I'm pretty sure that's where Boston came out on top, win the spawns, etc. So I know that's like kind of, going probably a little over the top on one very small play, but I just felt like I remember seeing that because it was very early in the Friday match, literally the first match that we saw for
Awesome.
the first map of that match, I should say. And it stuck out to me, and I was just like, yeah, that's probably something we didn't see for Snoopy. So I think that's got to be a good sign of potentially him for further developing as a player, or it could just be me, overanalyzing something small that happened in the map. But either way, that stuck out to me and want to share that.
Stuff like that could be something that we overlook, and not just saying we in particular, but kind of like the COD community in general is this idea of growth and development in the CDL, because I think, even I've caught myself on this a few times, and I've had to change my perception of a few players because I see them come into the CDL and they are not finished products by any means, and then I kind of judge them. I look at them and I say, well, they're just not at this level, like they, and I try to think like, oh well, they'll just never be at this level, but that's not how it always goes. Like it's not, obviously it's different when you have these like phenoms, like someone like Scump or Hydra, or Simp, Beezy, like these guys that come in and they're just like, they're so good immediately. We kind of expect these like 18, 19-year olds to be superstars right out of the gate. But that's not the case for the vast majority of CDL players, even the really good ones. And not to say like Snoopy is on that level by any means, or he will be, an MVP caliber player. But I think we do have to remember that Snoopy in particular is 20 years old. He just turned 20 a few months ago, and he has made mistakes. I don't think that there's any denying that from everything that's Slasher and some of the other guys have said. But there is the possibility for growth. Something that JCap said in the offseason about Geo was, he plays very selfish, and he kind of said like that's kind of how young players often do. And it takes time, it takes matches to kind of beat that out of their system. And it's like, okay, like I need to stop playing for kills. I need to stop, just reacting to every single thing that's happening on the map, and I just need to help my team win. To this point, it has helped Boston tremendously in that regard. A team that I want to talk about before we move any further is Carolina, because we can't talk about the CDL this season without just absolutely praising what the Royal Ravens have been doing for the first 2 weeks of the season. They are officially 4-0. They are officially the number one team in the CDL, according to the tiebreaker, because they have a better map win-loss than any other team in the league. And this was not expected by any means. We would probably expect, if any other team, to be, FaZe in that kind of category. And it's been the complete opposite. Carolina has been just really, really strong to this point. And I think part of that in the growth process, I guess, is maybe we have to change our opinions of some of these, I guess, quote unquote aging players like Slasher, who I believe is the oldest player. I think we said on the last few podcasts, like the oldest player in the CDL. TJ, who's been around for a while. Vivid, who has been bouncing around a few teams and hasn't been able to stick with any of them. And then there's Gwen, who we expected to keep growing and to keep getting better, and I think he's been even better maybe than we thought at this point in the season. And as a result, they are 4-0 and going to be the number one seed in the first CDL minor. So what have you made of Carolina's first few weeks of the CDL season? And do we owe an apology or anything to maybe Litigo and what he's able to do with this kind of team?
I don't think we need to owe an apology. I mean, we definitely we brought up that point of potentially this being the last opportunity for some of these guys on Carolina. But I was gassing Vivid up on being excited about just seeing what he was capable of doing with an AR in his hand when there were the reports of Vivid potentially switching to that AR role. And I think that was there were just questions around all of the players outside of Gwen really on this team, like Slasher. After the Boston stint last year didn't compete, so he was off for the second half of the season last year. And then TJ played well on Carolina last year, but he also didn't start the year on Carolina. That was a major one qualifier pickup, and he stuck around from there, but obviously has some pre-existing chemistry with Gwen to at least stick around and build off of. And then Vivid, like I said, yeah, that was a question mark or a wild card, if you will, for in terms of the role switch for him and the play style we saw from him historically in previous seasons. So it was definitely just some question marks around this Carolina team, and I don't think people necessarily were expecting them to be a 4-0 team right now, especially with a matchup against Atlanta FaZe that, like we were just talking about not too long ago, a lot of people probably expected Atlanta to win that one on paper. I do think it's important to also just look at who Carolina played, because I know we talked about it first time around. Their first match obviously was against Vegas Falcons, and as the Falcons debut in the CDL, and they've also played Gentlemates, Atlanta FaZe, and then we'll talk about the Cloud9 match eventually too. But um, yeah, I mean, on paper, their toughest match there is, whichever way you look at it, it's either against a struggling Atlanta FaZe or a Cloud9 team that was having issues with ping and whatnot in previous matches leading into this. So I guess you can pick your poison in terms of that, but it's not like the most grueling schedule that Carolina could have played. So I think that's going to be um, at least part of the conversation around this 4-0 start, not to take any credit away from what they've done, because obviously that's just it's great to see for those guys, and get off to this kind of start. It's sets you up for any hiccups along the way. Like we always talk about this as we get later into the seasons. Like there have been seasons in the past where teams miss out on champs by 10 points and stuff, and then you look back at some of the earlier moments in the season where it's like, oh, we had a winnable match early on against X team and we just fell flat, just choked, didn't show up. And it's like, if you're winning your matches early on, it only sets you up for potential future success. So especially for I've talked to Slasher a bunch in terms of interviewing him and stuff before. Like, I think he's a really smart player, and I think very highly of him. So I think this is uh, really great for him in terms of getting off to a start like this. And he's the type of player that can thrive off of that momentum, I feel like. And he's not going to be someone who, you know. will get complacent with a 4-0 start. He wants to win. That's always been what's driven him on whatever team he's been on in the past, and he's going to want to continue to succeed with this Carolina squad. So it's going to be exciting to see where they're able to take things from here. But I definitely do want to see them play against some of these other teams, and obviously we will eventually. But yeah, like I said, don't want to take any credit away from what they've accomplished so far. But I will like to see them square up against some of these other teams that we got playing well too.
Yeah, I think that is at least a point to be made, is that the three or the four teams that they have played so far, they have three combined wins between them. Because you have 1-3 C9, 1-3 FaZe, one or excuse me, I think it's actually two wins between them, because I think LAG and Vegas are both 0-4. So like, obviously all four teams that they've played are not performing up to standard, or they're just not good. I guess is the way to put it right now.
Still early.
Yeah, but everybody has kind of like the struggling beginnings, and there's always going to be teams that start slow. I don't think we necessarily expected it to be C9 and FaZe in particular, but that's how it went this season. But Carolina has made the most of it, and in a lot of ways they've kind of been dominant in some ways. Like they're 9-2, I believe, in respawn so far this season. 6-1 in hardpoint. Their only loss was against C9 in the opening hardpoint of their series today, and then they come back in the second hardpoint in nearly 100 point club C9. It was 250 to 105 in the second hardpoint, and they end up reverse sweeping that series. So like that stuff where some of the momentum can be broken, and then they're able to kind of get back on it and win those matches. That's very important. It's something that we didn't necessarily see from Carolina in the past, where they could beat up on some of the worst teams in the league, but even then they were not always the strongest, and they would let up those losses. And like you were mentioning, these kind of matches do matter in the end, because there might not be a big difference between 8th and 9th, or maybe Carolina will be higher, but you definitely want to be like maybe 5th instead of 6th, so on and so forth. So I'm really impressed by what Carolina's been doing. Way better than I thought. I expected them to be, fighting. I don't know exactly where the tier was, or where I had them in my tier list when we did the preseason power rankings. But I certainly didn't think that they would be 4-0 after week 2, or anywhere close to that. And they should be praised for that.
I will say too, I mean, I know we're not going through the matches as much, but just the first reverse sweep of the year, again, not a huge deal or anything, but I think that just that makes me think a little, regardless of who it's against, like just early on, any team having the resilience to pull off a reverse sweep against a team that's already, kind of punched you in the mouth for two maps. Not necessarily saying like those maps were blowouts, but like and any team that goes up 2-0 or goes down 2-0 and then is able to respond by rattling off three maps in a row, that's just like a good sign, I feel like, because if you're able to do that at any point, it at least like it's in the back of your mind that you can do it, right? So like if Carolina gets to land at Major One and they're facing an 0-2 deficit, it's not like, oh shit, our tournament's over or whatever. It's like you know in the back of your mind you can do it on this particular game with this particular team. Obviously, all those guys have had reverse sweeps on various teams and various COD games and wager matches, lands, etc. But just knowing again, like reaffirming and just getting that confidence, I feel like is important. So that was good to see today too from them in particular.
Which way do you want to go now? Maybe we start with, or maybe we continue with LAT. We kind of just talk
Sure.
about what might be the best team in the league. A team that is right up there with Carolina at the top of the standings. LAT now 4-0 to start the season, which quite quite expected, I think, for most of us. Granted, they have played a few tougher teams, but and have been tested a little bit. But I think we generally thought with the talent of this team that they were capable of winning these first four matches, and they have looked really, really impressive. I think they might be the only team where every player has a 1.0 KD or better so far this season, but they have looked incredible, especially in hardpoint. They are now 7-1 in hardpoint. I mean, I think we all expected them to be good. Maybe they have been better. Are they? Would you say that they're the best team in the league to this point, or do you have anybody above them at this point?
No, I think right now you got to stick with LAT as the top team. Like most people had, you know, the three team league or however you want to phrase it. Most people were looking at LAT, OpTic, and FaZe, in no particular order there, as the top rated teams coming into the season on paper. Obviously, FaZe hasn't lived up to that early on, and OpTic had just one small hiccup with the loss to Boston, but then obviously a much bigger situation where it's now a different roster with no Pred and Huke in the picture. So I think, just based on that, like if you had LAT ranked highly early on and they're undefeated, there's no reason to knock them off that pedestal until we are given a reason or have something to criticize about them. Um, so yeah, I think it's pretty safe to say they're top dogs right now. I will say just about their matches in particular this week, that first matchup in the Battle of LAG was an absolute banger, especially the two hard points were literally separated by 10 points. The first one was 250 241 on Rewind, and then we had a 250 249 banger on Skyline. I found a tweet from Scrap Stream that was posted by Spawn Up GG on Twitter where he compared Skyline to Bokage, and that was tweeted the day before this 250 to 249 showdown on Skyline, where the quote is, "It's like Bokage. Who the fuck wants to play Bokage? It's the worst map ever." And then they, of course, just naturally have a 1 point game the following day. So I thought that was kind of funny. Me personally, Skyline was actually, I was just a little surprised because I feel like Skyline, at least in pubs for multiplayer, is a very exciting map. It felt like it wasn't necessarily too small, but because there's in the pub rotation, there's like Babylon and um, the map with the hangar that I'm already forgetting the name of because I've been playing too much zombies. But there are much smaller maps, so Skyline didn't feel as small, but maybe like just in terms of the CDL and ranked map pool, like Skyline is one of those smaller maps and more Bocage-esque. Um, but either way, I mean, there were definitely some teams during Vanguard who didn't like Bocage and avoided playing it. I know LAT, like I'm pretty sure that was their auto veto at Champs, and they ended up winning Champs. Um, but from a viewer perspective, Bocage was like pure entertainment. There was just a ton of kills being dropped, and I feel like, you early on we get a 250, 249 banger like this one. Like, I think at least from a fan perspective, that could be exciting to see going on. Maybe from the player side of things, they're like, this is getting tiring, and maybe we'll see Skyline like slowly not played as much or something. But I hope to see more of that just because I do like that map, and I think it could lead to more exciting moments and just frantic endings and stuff like that in this showdown here. But yeah, so I mean that was kind of surprising. I know we historically had talked about it, LAG just in overall having a 9-3 record against LA Thieves in the Battle of LA heading into this one. So now it's 9-4 after LAT won on Friday. But those hard points in particular were really close, and I think that was surprising for everybody probably watching, despite anybody who was just like preying on the LAG Battle of LA magic to continue. And then we had the last match today against Minnesota, which Minnesota was a team who, came out hot and won a couple game fives and probably had a better start than some people expected. And they to give them credit here too, like they played tough in the hard points again for LATs. Like we said, LATs has been winning the hard points early on in the season, but they haven't necessarily been total blowouts. There was 100 point. I think they had 200 point clubs in the first week, but this week definitely didn't have just the same lopsided blowouts. But they're still getting the job done in hardpoint, which is the most important thing at the end of the day. But more important for me that stood out in the Minnesota matchup in particular is they win 15 points. On red card hard point to start out the matchup. Then Minnesota responds, taking the search 6-1, and we get a protocol control, which I believe we've only seen twice now. But we get the protocol control, and Minnesota goes up 2-0 in that. So they're one round away from taking a 2-1 series lead against LA Thieves, and the Thieves pull off a reverse sweep in the control, take it 3-2, take the following hard point, so they win through the respawns and close out this weekend of matches undefeated. So that was obviously a turning point. We always talk about control being like that swing mode or the map 3, no matter what the mode has been like in Call of Duty being the swing mode. An example right here, very evidently, of just Minnesota was very close to making things even more interesting and changing the narrative a little bit potentially. But at the end of the day, LA Thieves is just a really good team, and they've shown it so far. And I'm looking forward to seeing as much of these guys play as possible, because I think for as much as we're talking about them looking good early on and playing well, like I think this is the team that they realistically can only get better as they play more, and that's got to be a scary notion for the rest of the league.
Yeah, for sure. I do want to kind of keep on LAG and Minnesota. I think that there are a few teams that we can kind of group together here because I'm not entirely sure what to make of them as we get out of this first 2 weeks. I have 4 teams that are just kind of weird right now: Miami, Vancouver, LAG, and Minnesota. For different reasons. Obviously, LAG is at the bottom with an 0-4 record, and then Minnesota is at 2-2. Vancouver and Miami both at 1-3. But I'm not entirely sure what to make of these 4 teams because LAG they're 0-4, sure. But as you just mentioned, they gave LAT a pretty good run. Had very competitive hard points that could have gone either way. They lose game fives to both Minnesota and OpTic, and they lose a series to Carolina, who we've talked about is 4-0 and is looking incredibly good at this point in the season. And then you look at Minnesota, they started 2-0, like you mentioned, they win those game fives. And then they come in this week, they play C9 and they play LAT. They lose in 4 games to both of those teams. Vancouver, they've only played teams that are either 3-1 or 4-0 currently. And Miami has lost 3 consecutive game fives. So I'm not entirely sure if they're good teams, if they're bad teams, if they're just somewhere in the middle. But what do you make of this kind of? I think it's more of like a logjam in the middle. I guess we always kind of get this, but would you agree that these 4 teams in particular are kind of hard to place at this current point in time?
Sure. I mean, that's just the thing as we're going through all of these teams, really. Like, it's 4 online matches that we're judging these teams off of and trying to draw conclusions for. So it's still incredibly early on, and even though we've talked about FaZe a great deal, but just for lack of a better example, like, FaZe is a team where we're talking about right now them struggling and being 1-3, but at the end of the day, like that narrative could be just completely flipped later on in the season, and multiple people probably expect that to be the case, right? So, I think that's a fair assessment for all of these teams. Yeah, they're not getting off to, and in some cases they're not getting off to the start some of them may have hoped, and it's how you're able to respond to that adversity, and what you're able to do to change things around a little bit, regardless of what your specific situation is. But I think that's just like some of these teams that we didn't necessarily consider as SS tier heading into the season. It's just gonna take some time, and you want to see more out of all of these teams. But those teams in the middle of the pack in particular, it's like they're that's why it's the middle of the pack, for lack of a better term, right? Like, you expect them to trade blows. They're gonna beat Team A sometimes, but they're gonna lose to Team B other times, and it's gonna be a tussle and tug of war in terms of uh, who's able to actually come out on top. And that's what we kind of talked about that a lot last year on the show, in terms of um, like the battle for fifth place, where
Mm-hmm.
at points it looked like Vegas Legion might have a claim to that, and then at other points that Vegas started struggling and went to some other teams and whatnot. So, um, yeah, I mean, everybody's gonna be in different situations, and end of the day, you know it's still very early on. But I mean, there's definitely been some signs of life from all of these teams in my eyes. Like, just looking gentle mates, they literally early on, I didn't look at the numbers for these most recent matches, but I just know the first set of matches I had highlighted Lins and being like, he was showing up and slaying well early on, and that was a good sign for this potential NYSL reunion roster of plus Lins minus Hydra. Like, if he can kind of step into that role to any degree, then that's got to be where this team finds success. Even a team like Minnesota, like, I mean, there were some people who didn't expect them to be 2-0 after week one. So the fact they are 2-2 after they play teams that on paper, again, most people probably expected C9 and LA Thieves to be Minnesota, regardless of what happened in the first week, and sure that's what happens here. But that's still just a young team with potential, and they're gonna go through ups and downs with just the ebbs and flows of the season and whatnot. But yeah, and I mean, Miami and Vancouver too. They got some guys. Like, Vancouver's got Abuza 04 we talked about. Miami with Real, just a couple of guys who were in their first years last year, and how they build off of that first year, and where they continue to grow and develop. And we've seen moments very early on this year from those guys. I mean, I just, the one that sticks out to me is Real having a 1.5 last week and losing. So, like, again, that's a long-winded way of saying, like, all of these teams have potential, and it's just, it's going to take longer for some teams to figure it out than others. And obviously that's just, that time isn't a luxury that all the teams have. A team like Carolina that starts 4-0, they have that luxury where if they go through a struggle, like, they have the 4-0 start to fall back on. Whereas a team on the other end of the spectrum, like Gentlemates, if they continue to struggle and continue to lose, they don't have that, little buffer from a good start to the season to fall back on if it just keeps going down the path they're on right now. So, interesting to see more from all of these teams, really, though, because there's definitely some key pieces and some exciting elements to all the teams, regardless of the results early on in the season.
Another team I think that fits kind of that mold is C9, because we talked so much about them last week, and that was a lot in regards to the internet stuff and how much it played into an 0-2 week that wasn't just 0-2. It was, they were getting dominated in those matches. It wasn't particularly close, especially for what you would expect of a team like Cloud9 with the roster that they have. This week, they were remarkably better. It wasn't even close. There was a huge difference between the C9 we saw last week and the C9 we saw this week. The first match they win against Minnesota, they hand the Rocker, I believe, their first loss of the season, and it was a competitive series, especially those first two maps. A close hard point. They go to round 11 and Surge C9 ends up winning, and then they dominate in the second hard point after losing the control. And then a series we mentioned earlier was C9 getting reverse swept by Carolina, the first reverse sweep of the season so far. And so they had a very good chance to go 2-2 through these first 2 weeks, to go 2-0 this past week, and they let it slip through their fingers. And it wasn't incredibly close series the last half of the way against Carolina. The Royal Ravens kind of turned it on. Were you encouraged though by what C9 was able to kind of put together after a horrible week 1 and all of the talk coming from that?
Yeah, I mean that's just the overall thing for C9. I feel like is I wasn't checking Twitter too closely, but I didn't see any major complaints about ping, and I think sort of bringing up that idea I mentioned at the end of last week's show was like maybe this is not going to be an online match exclusive issue for them, but just a match or a ping issue with only teams in Texas issue. And if Minnesota and Carolina weren't playing from Texas, then maybe they were able to find a different server, and that's why we saw matches more aligned with what people were expecting from this C9 team. So we'll have to see after with the minor and the other online matches coming up. Maybe if we see them play against some other Texas teams and have issues, then we just know going forward, like maybe the online matches against Texas teams are going to be tough, but other teams in the league, you can kind of expect it to play more to what you expect on paper a little bit. But end of the day, yeah, I mean, you don't want to see the reverse sweep. It obviously would have been a lot better for C9 if they just go 2-0 this week. Objectively, that's a pretty dumb statement, but that's just it 2-0 is better than 1-1. But definitely some encouraging signs out of them regardless. I feel like even today, like I just while watching the matches without having the numbers right in front of me, I feel like I even saw just in the chat for the stream like people talking about Mac and Mac having some good moments. And that was one of the things with this team we talked about in the off season of just Mac being that wild card. We know what he's capable of in the past, and just anybody after being out of the CDL for a full year, like what you're able to do on your return, that has to be questioned. I don't care if it's Crimsix or Karma or anybody. Like if you step away for any amount of time, let alone a year, like it might not be easy to immediately jump back in and just fry right off the bat. But so far, especially in this most recent set of matches, it looked like Mac was playing a little better, and it's tough to judge because I bet if you look at the overall KD, the first two matches where they were having the ping issues might skew the overall numbers in comparison to what he was putting up this week. But I don't even have the numbers for him for this week in front of me, so I could just be spewing BS. But end of the day, overall for C9, like it felt like this was definitely a little more indicative of what many people were expecting out of this team. And yeah, I think that's got to be, especially after a week where, again, we talked about the online issues, but those were going to be two tough matches for C9 regardless in the previous week. So just putting that in the rearview mirror and getting a win on the board, obviously, again, would have loved to have two, would have loved to have avoided a reverse sweep, but that's, you can't do anything about that now. Just we'll have to see what C9 continues to bring to the table after the holiday break.
Yeah, that Minnesota win was really big because let's say they lose that series and then they go on to get reverse swept by Carolina. Like the conversation around Cloud9 at that point is way different. At least we have some kind of positive to come out of this week with in regards to C9, because if they didn't beat Minnesota, man, we're talking about them like the same way we kind of approach the conversation about FaZe, but we don't have the background of C9 or this particular roster being like a championship level team with championship players very recently. Like, that's the conversation would just be completely different. So it's good that they picked up the win against Minnesota. They did, at various points look, good against Carolina. And I think, we should expect them to look hopefully better as they keep going on, and maybe they get used to some of the online issues. I don't know if that's something that they can necessarily get used to, and certainly not play to their advantage, but it is something that they're going to have to play through at least for the foreseeable future, and hopefully they can do so. One team I want to talk about, I don't want to end on a low note, so I will talk about Vegas now before we get to Toronto. Vegas, again, like they look like a relatively normal, bad CDL team. Nothing new there, but they are now 0-4 and have the worst map win-loss of any team in the CDL to this point, 2-12 after week 2. I think a lot of people were talking in particular about King of Bodhi and like his place in the CDL. And to come to his defense, in just like in general, this team is not necessarily built to be like a championship contender. I think that's quite obvious. It's built to grow the scene in the Middle East and Saudi Arabia in particular. So like the fact that he's on this roster is kind of indicative of that. I understand why some people would push back against that. But I think Clayster made the point on Twitter, and he is biased in that regard because he is an assistant coach for Vegas at this point. But if you look at what the Legion were doing the last few seasons, where they were fielding, a minimum roster, essentially trying to spend as little money as possible on their team while maintaining that they had a CDL team, I would much prefer this, where there's at least a goal, or there was some semblance of a goal for the Vegas Falcons in kind of promoting Call of Duty in a different region that Call of Duty is not necessarily known for, rather than Vegas, who's just kind of not getting to champs, or getting close to champs, and not fielding championship level rosters anyway. So I'm more in favor of that. But Kix looks good. Like he looks like he might be like a CDL level player, at least just in the talent department. So for that part, it's good. It kind of exposes us to new talent and guys that we would have never really seen at this stage, at least. Other than if not for the Vegas Falcons coming in. So I'll say that. I don't know if you had any thoughts about Vegas and kind of what they're doing right now, but it's obvious that they're the worst team in the CDL. I don't think other CDL teams should be losing a series to them, but I think it's possible. Like they're able to, they pulled off a map against FaZe. I don't know if that says something about Vegas. I don't know if it says more about FaZe. They won a map against Carolina, which is impressive. That's something that FaZe didn't do. So I don't know. What have you made of Vegas so far?
No, I mean, just overall, like even some of those worst teams that we talk about, like who was it, 2022 Paris Legion or whatever, the team that
Something like
won
that.
only 2 games, and then even a team like Boston last year, like those teams didn't, like the Paris Legion team that only won 2 games. Yeah, sure, they only won 2 games, but like let's just for sake of recency using Boston last year, I think the Boston team had 8 wins last year in the CDL season, not counting the Esports World Cup. So like even your team that's at the very bottom of the barrel is still winning matches. So realistically, this has been the case in Call of Duty, no matter what, is that any team can beat another team on any given day. Now this Vegas Falcons team is at more of a disadvantage than some of those other teams in previous years where the players on the team just don't have that CDL experience. This is the best competition they have played against in their Call of Duty careers, and it's going to take time for them to adjust and learn, but that's the important thing for this Vegas Falcon squad this year, is just if the plan is to stick with this roster for the foreseeable future, they have to gain as much experience and just be sponges. I feel like I've used that word a lot when talking about them, and just soak up as much information and knowledge and experience as they can from all of these matches. Like, yeah, you don't want to go a full season without winning or anything like that, but these teams, like, whatever the sayings are about like losing is learning, yada yada. I don't need to go on too long about it, but realistically, like that's just where that team is right now. Is like they're gonna go in, and I highlighted it in the past episodes. Like there was that moment against Carolina. I remember. I think it might have been Khaled or Kicks or whatever. I can't even remember who it was now, but he was on Skyline Search against Carolina, and like it was like a very tight angle. He was by the stairs by Piano, and he was looking towards the bomb, and Slasher was on a head glitch on the table, and he just like literally like just aimed right on it and snapped and evaporated Slasher, and I was like, holy shit, like that just really took me off guard. Like, probably anybody else does it, I probably would have had a similar reaction, but just not just like, wow, I'm mind blown that just happened like that. Um, but that's just like these guys can shoot, and they're just gonna have to learn how to play the game the way it's played over here. And like I said, this is the best experience they're gonna this is the most valuable time they have to learn and gain experience. And um we'll have to see how they're able to go from here. But I mean, it's gonna. I feel like it's inevitable that they're gonna win a match this year,
Yeah.
and then we're gonna have a whole talk about, oh my God, like is this the sign of the apocalypse or something like that? No, it's not. It's not necessarily that. I think I feel like it's inevitable, it will happen, and we'll have a conversation about it when it does. Um, but it's just that's the nature of Call of Duty. Like team. I mean, we literally had Boston beat
OpTic.
OpTic
Yeah.
early this year. So like any team can realistically beat any other team on any given day. That's just Call of Duty and what it is. I mean, you can have a sport like baseball. You play 162 games. Like the White Sox had a historically bad year this year. They still won 30 something games, and they didn't go 0 and 162. So like, it's just not a great example for esports fans. But yeah, end of the day, like tough start for Vegas. I think most people expected this, but it's what they do with these losses. Like they can just sulk and be upset about it, but I don't, from what I've seen so far, obviously I don't know those guys, but from what I've seen so far, it doesn't seem like that's the situation is. And obviously we know Clayster, and we know what how passionate he is about winning and being competitive. Like it feels like if they work together, they can learn from these losses early on and try to be even more competitive than we are. I mean, quite frankly, there were probably some CDL fans who thought they wouldn't even win a map to start the year, right? But they've definitely
Mhm.
been more competitive than even those very pessimistic onlookers would, just expect from the squad. So yeah, I think the bar is low for a lot of people's expectations for Vegas Falcons, but I think even the low bar is slightly higher than what people would have thought going right into the season.
Yeah, and I if those guys should be delusional in a way, because like every athlete is, they think that they're best, they think they can win any map or whatever. Like that's something that they should take with them. At the same point, they should understand, and people around them should be understanding, like, okay, we're going to lose. Like, we did not build a championship level roster. It's going to be very difficult, especially in the beginning. But as long as we're making progress, then that's kind of a win in and of itself. But to kind of your point, and look at the Boston Breach last season. Like they went on a 15 match losing streak, months at a time without winning, and then they beat OpTic Texas, and they snapped their losing streak. And that's all it takes is Boston won. They didn't win another match that season. Like they lost their last few matches of the year and they were done. But they beat at the time the best team in the game, and it just happens. Like there's teams that will go through slumps, and slumps so bad that a team like Vegas can beat them and will beat them. I'd be stunned if they went 0 and whatever 28 or whatever it is, however many matches they'll play this season. That just seems impossible at this point. So they will win eventually, and like you said, we will be talking about it like, oh my God, should this other team break up because it's so bad? But they've done about as expected, a little bit better than expected to this point in the season. And to finish on a high note, let's talk about Toronto, a team that finished 4-0 in these first 2 weeks of the Major One qualifiers. Definitely better than I expected them right out of the gate. And where would you put them? Because I think both of us were thinking. Oh, I was thinking a little bit lower than you, so I was, thinking maybe somewhere around fifth or sixth, and then they're kind of fighting for that fourth through sixth spot. But it certainly seems like they should be considered in probably the top three, maybe even the top two if you're not entirely convinced of OpTic with Huke right now. So where would you kind of put them if you're, we're not doing our entire power rankings. We'll do that on the next show. But where do you think Toronto is after these first few weeks of the CDL season?
I really honestly don't have a good answer. Obviously, anybody who's listened to the past couple episodes knows how excited I've been about what we've seen very early on with this Toronto roster, but it's a weird spot because longtime Ego Chall listeners also know just like how much I believe in FaZe and those guys and the talent on that roster. And obviously, I understand Toronto beat Atlanta already this season, but how much stock can we put in this early sample size, and how much can that impact the power rankings to the point of like Toronto jumping FaZe, for example? I don't have a solid answer to those questions, and I don't think I would want to move them. But for the record, I mean, I like you said, I had Toronto fourth heading into this season, so I'm very confident with where I rated them beforehand. And if I had to, gun to my head right now, I would probably keep them fourth. And I would say like, yeah, you can probably debate maybe having them jump FaZe, and because I mean even for 1 through 3 I didn't give like a solid
Mm-hmm.
1 is 1 that for Toronto, or for Thieves, OpTic, and Atlanta. I didn't necessarily rank them 1 through 3. I just said they are the top 3, and then I gave Toronto for 4. But so I don't know. It would be tough. You could definitely debate it, especially just based on what we've seen so far. But again, it's very early. Only 4 online matches to judge that on. But it is definitely encouraging signs for Toronto. Which again, just overall grand picture, this was a team that has lost Scrappy and Envoy. Envoy, literally a world champion, Scrap, an MVP caliber player for his 2 years in the CDL, a rookie of the year, and they haven't missed a beat after losing 2 players like that. Sure, you can look at, you could argue the statistical numbers that Envoy put up while playing for Toronto. We can have that debate too, but end of the day, Envoy's a really good player. So Scrap, and there were the off-season talks where Toronto was just like, yeah, we just can't feasibly keep this roster together of Insight, Kleenex, Scrap, and Envoy. Scrap and Envoy obviously go to their quote-unquote super team, which is looking like that's paying off early on. And Toronto could have gone in multiple directions. They could have only kept Kleenex and, picked up 3 people. They could have only kept Insight and picked up 3 people. They could have wiped the slate clean and had a completely new squad, but they stick with Kleenex and Insight, pick up 2 guys in Beans and Joe Deceives, who were definitely, again, they were wild cards. Joe Deceives was on LA Thieves last year, had a stretch where he was benched early on, then he comes back into the roster. LA Thieves had a strong finish to the season last year, and Beans had shown slaying potential early in the previous season, wasn't in the CDL to start last year, and then kind of got that chance at the Esports World Cup and towards the end of the year. So 2 guys who were really, again, similar to the Mac conversation, just wild cards. We just hadn't seen a ton of them, or just hadn't seen like full seasons of them in the CDL, and it's paying off very early on. So again, it is early, only 4 matches in, but I do like what I've seen from Toronto so far. Definitely wasn't the hardest schedule for them this week. Obviously, they played Vegas, and then they played Miami, and they started strong against Miami. They lose 2 maps. In the middle there, 3-4 with a close skyline hardpoint, which goes back to the bow cage comparison I brought up earlier. But they clutch up in the searches against Miami, win 12-2, round count 2-6-1. So that's got to be encouraging there. But yeah, end of the day, Toronto's 4-0, so they're in a good position. That's where you want to be after 4 matches, no matter what team you are. You want to win as much as you can. So I like what I've seen so far. It will be interesting to see how it plays out for them, just continuing to go forward. But I do think it's exciting that Toronto is in this position when you could have argued that like after losing players like Scrap and Envoy, this might not have been a possibility.
Yeah, and I think that's really just the biggest point for me is that I was concerned about how they were going to replace the firepower of Scrap, because you're losing a superstar, not just a very good player, but one of the very best, if not the best player and a lot of teams that have to replace that kind of thing it's just not easy. It's almost not feasible in a lot of ways, but that's just kind of a credit to Toronto and like the coaching staff and the management there, that they're always able to kind of churn out a competitive roster almost every single year. It's really a credit to what they're doing there and how they evaluate players, and what they thought of Joe DeCeves and Beans, guys who hadn't broken out as superstars or stars or anything, but they've obviously they were obviously very confident in those guys becoming winning players with their existing duo. So a big credit, big tip of the hat, I guess, to Toronto and what they're doing there. And now they're 4-0. Certainly seem like a legitimate contender as we move forward in the CDL season. But that does it for. And do you want to go through the matches and stuff?
Yeah, I just want to give the rundown so we have all the results. So did this last time too, but I'll just go real quick. On Friday, December 13th, we had LAT versus Gentlemates in the Battle of LA. LAT wins that one 3-1. C9 versus Minnesota. Cloud9 comes out on top 3-1 in there to get that first win after the slow start in the previous week with the ping issues. Miami versus Boston. Boston wins a game 5 and takes that one 3-2 over Miami. OpTic versus Vancouver and Huke's debut or return to OpTic. OpTic wins that one 3-1. On Saturday, December 14th, Toronto versus Vegas. Toronto wins 3-0. OpTic versus Gentlemates. OpTic takes this one 3-2. Again, as we mentioned almost an hour ago now, that is OpTic looking good in search very early on with the new Huke edition. Carolina versus Atlanta, probably one of the most surprising results of this past set, with Carolina beating Atlanta 3-0. And then Boston versus Vancouver. Boston wins another game 5 and takes this one 3-2. And today, Sunday, December 15th, we had Toronto 3-2 over Miami. Atlanta FaZe beating Vegas 3-1. Carolina with a reverse sweep over Cloud9 3-2. And LA Thieves versus Minnesota. LAT comes out on top 3-1.
And the standings as it stands going into this holiday break, as we've done 2 weeks of the 2025 CDL season, the Major 1 qualifiers. So we're a little bit over halfway through the qualifier set. So at the top, tied for first place, Carolina, LAT, and Toronto, all at 4-0. Then you have Boston and OpTic, 2 teams that you would not expect to be next to each other in the standings. They're tied for 4th at 3-1. Minnesota by themselves at 6th place, 2-2. And then there is a 4-way tie for 7th at 1-3. Miami, Vancouver, Cloud9, and FaZe. And at the bottom, tied for 11th, LA Gorillas Mate and the Vegas Falcons, 0-4, both of them. And that goes into the minor, which we will talk about probably in a few weeks, or I'm not sure exactly when we will discuss it, but we will preview the first CDL minor, which, if you're not familiar and maybe you weren't paying attention when they announced the CDL schedule this season, the minors are a single elimination online tournament in the middle of the first 2 major qualifiers. So a Major 1 and Major 2 qualifiers. It will be split up by this single elimination tournament involving all 12 teams. The top 4 teams from those standings that I just read, they get first round buys, and then the bottom 8 they play in the first round, and we'll go through it there. But I think it's just interesting. We'll talk about it more. But Carolina, Boston, LAT, and Toronto, those 4 teams get the buys into the second round, which is incredible. Definitely the 4 teams that we all expected to get the buys, but I think it's going to be really interesting. OpTic versus Vegas, a very juicy first round matchup that we'll talk about when we actually preview the first minor. But you link these KD leaders as we get out of the first few weeks. And I think they're pretty interesting because there's some surprises. Shotzi has played like a superstar, shout out Aches. But then you look at Kicks from Vegas. He's at 3rd in KD. Gwen, I think, is like no surprise, is incredible, but he is at the very, very top of the KD leaderboard with a 1.33 KD. And his teammate Slasher in 4th at 1.19. And then you got Dashi, and Pred is also there at 1.17. Your boy Kleenex at 7th with a 1.17, and Scrappy is the last player on this leaderboard with a 1.13 KD. So some surprises, some expected players. Any thoughts or opinions on those as we obviously they will change, I would assume,
Yeah,
very,
yeah.
very much throughout the CDL season.
Yeah, still very early, but I guess three really that are really uh most glaring that just stick out to me in particular: Gwyn, Kicks, and Slasher. For Slasher, kind of just we know what he's capable of, and just to see him doing it and succeeding early on has got to be good for his fans and for him personally. Um, Kicks, obviously, that's got to be a surprise to a lot of people, but based on the way he's been shooting some of these matches, it makes sense. And it's just, again, like it goes back to what we were just talking about. The Vegas team can shoot. It's just, can they put it all together to get some wins? And then for Gwen, really, like, that was one of the talking points we talked about before the season, is just like he was the rookie of the year last year. Abuza kind of disputed that, didn't really think Gwen should have been rookie of the year. Should have thought he should have been, but um, I kind of just raised the question like, where does Gwen go in year two? What do we see from him? And obviously, very early on, but got to be encouraging for Gwen and his supporters to see him at the top of the KD leaderboard very early on. Um, could drastically change, like you alluded to, but for Gwen and what we have seen from him in the year plus now of his CDL career, it's just when he is playing his best, that's when Carolina saw success, and Carolina's seen success early on, so it's not surprising to see him at the top of the list.
Yeah, he's been incredible. Like I mentioned earlier, I think he's great. Made an even greater leap than I was maybe even expecting. Granted, there's a ton of time left, but as we can only judge on what's actually happened, and he's done incredibly, incredibly well. Pick him to this point in the season. You are 16-8 after going 8-4 this past week, and I'm 14-10 after going 7-5 in week 2. Again, it's kind of tough, these matches and how we're predicting them. Granted, FaZe being like not very good so far is a big wrench in our plans. I think they're typically
we're both 1-3 in those, I think. And actually, no, you picked LA Thieves to beat them, but yeah,
but typically we are pro FaZe and picking them on every single match. But when they're losing all but one, that kind of changes our plans. Yeah, but that about does it for the show. I actually didn't see all these YouTube comments because I'm on Restream and the chat isn't working on there. But shout out to all the people that are in the YouTube live stream. I think there's 11 viewers right now. I saw that we had 7 and 9 viewers a few minutes ago. So appreciate you all stopping by and watching. And thanks for commenting. Guys like Elwood, Crazy Snow, Carlos, Blizzard, Payback, all those guys. So appreciate you stopping by and giving us your support. If you haven't done so, please subscribe to the YouTube channel. I think we're at 165 subscribers, which means that we've gained like 15 subscribers in like the last 2 weeks or last week or something. So I remember when we when we hit 150 subscribers, which was not very long ago, and we're already at 165. So appreciate all of you. Shout out Zach, who just said W podcast in the chat. We honestly, this has been amazing. Like the start to the season has been really fun as far as the CDL matches go and kind of the storylines that have come out of that, but also the support that we've been given from our little community here, especially on YouTube, which we've been uploading videos daily these last 2 weeks, I believe. And we're trying to continue to do that. Obviously, with the holidays, it makes it a whole lot harder. But we're going to continue to try to create some content that you guys might enjoy every day, so you can kind of keep up with us, even as we take a little bit of a break in the holidays, which we're not exactly sure when the podcast will be, because that's just kind of how the holidays work. I'll be going out of town. I'm actually covering the Ohio State Tennessee college football playoff game next weekend in Columbus, where my parents and I'm from. So it's going to be a cool experience. But we will be doing a live stream on Wednesday, December 18th, I believe it is, and then that'll be the live stream. The podcast will go into your feed on Thursday morning as usual. And if you prefer the podcast, you can look at Amazon Music, Apple Podcasts, Spotify. You could listen to it on YouTube as well. That's how I listen to podcasts. So if that's something you enjoy, please feel free to do so. We will be back on Wednesday to talk about probably our power rankings. I would like to at least check in on them, see if there are any changes. I certainly will be changes for mine just based on how I feel about power rankings in general. So we'll probably talk about it then. Maybe if any news drops in the next 3 days, which usually we would
Any
always
more
get screwed.
surprise roster changes?
Yeah, usually we'd be getting screwed at Monday or Tuesday, and we do the podcast like the day before everything drops. But hopefully that doesn't happen. Hopefully everything drops before Wednesday evening, and we're able to talk about whatever it is in the Call of Duty esports space. Make sure to give us a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts. Thumbs up. Please like the videos on YouTube. Leave a comment if you would. Be so nice and so inclined. Follow us on Twitter at jbink with 2Ks, at Pres Byers, podcast Twitter at Ego Chall Podcast. The Twitch channel is twitch.tv/Ego Chall Podcast. The YouTube channel, just look up Ego Chall Podcast on YouTube as well. And again, we'll be back on Wednesday, Thursday morning for the podcast feed. And that does it for me. Bink, take it away.
Yeah, I mean, you kind of hit the nail on the head with what I was going to say here, but thank you guys as always for all the support. Kind of like you mentioned, I'm pretty sure we were at 160 subscribers heading into tonight, and we're at 166 now. So even since the time you stopped talking, we already gained another sub. So thank you guys for all the support, all the people in chat that Preston shouted out to. It was awesome to see. That's 2 straight YouTube streams in a row where chat's been popping. We had a bunch of viewers, and that's just always good to see. So thank you guys as always. Really appreciate it. If you guys have any criticism, constructive criticism, or any feedback or anything else you want to see from us, leave it in the comments for the videos or leave it in the streams. We read all that stuff, and yeah, we'll see you guys back here on Wednesday. We'll figure out the holiday stuff like Preston said, but we got more stuff to talk about before we get to that point. So yeah, thanks as always, guys, and remember to send the chow.